Last Saturday, not yesterday, but the Saturday before, we had a beautiful funeral here for Ethel Ford in our sanctuary. Now, what several of you are not aware of was some of the scrambling going on in the background. And I was the master scrambler because I was not ready. We didn't have the pyramids up. We didn't have the signs up. And after the service, I thought no, I can't do this anymore. It's way too much. So I asked for help too late and took on too much to do myself. I have a hard time asking for help. So as we talk with friends, and I have a clergy support group, we are just recognizing we're in it, and sometimes we take on too much, and sometimes things fall apart, and life is just messy. And that's what we recognize. But then we also go a little bit deeper and think of, well, Dietmar, what makes it so hard for you to ask for help? Well, and then I think of, well, I think I want to take care of it. I want to do well. I want to cover it all. I want to. And then we explore more and more, and sometimes it ends up in a position where I think oh, so who do you try to please, or whose approval do you want to get? Or sometimes it comes back to my parents. So if my mom or dad were hard on me, then sometimes I'm hard on myself. So exploring some of those stories, some of those scripts, some of the limitations with which we grew up is an important part of our lives. It's just part of growing up is to recognize our stories by which we live. So who do you try to please? Whose permission do you want to get to do something? And to whose standards do you try to live up to? Is it you and what wants to come into the world through you? Wonderful. Or do you try to please someone else and try to fit into what sometimes feels like a corset? One of my colleagues said, we all walk in shoes that are too small for us. Sometimes I imagine, you have these fenced-in areas, the underground fence for dogs, and the dogs have a collar that shocks them so they don't escape. And when you take the collar off, they're often so trained that they don't even go there, so they're used to it. That's sometimes, I think, like how we live. We are primed, we have our shock collar when we don't live up to growing up to others' expectations. We're confined to that space. And then the wire and the limitations and the constraints are pulled out, or you get the collar off, you still stay too much in those limitations. So where and how do we live too small lives, too constrained, too confined? What stories do we live by? What are those stories in the back of our head that sometimes come like, well, I don't think I'm good enough, or I need this thing to really be happy, or that, or that, or that, or I hope to get the approval of so-and-so, of my boss, or whatever else. Well, you can fill in the blanks. So what scripts, what stories, what confining limitations from your past do you try to live up to versus the freedom of the children of God, the freedom of those who are loved for who they are, the freedom of those whom God treasures, and whom God in a baptism says, "You're my beloved." Two blind men come to Jesus, and Jesus asks them, "Do you believe that I can heal you?" Always feel weird talking about healing of the blind and the healing overall of sick people. When I look around me, there is so much pain and so much sickness. I never think that these healing stories apply to every situation in our lives that we see around us. They're just some diseases, illnesses that don't have a cure. And Jesus does not heal all of that. So while Jesus healed these two men, that's what the story says. The question that I see in this story is, do you come like these two men to Jesus and say, "With all my heart, I believe that you can heal me"? And Jesus asking you, do you really believe I can heal you? And then opening up the story a little bit, you recognize it's not just about eyesight, it's about the vision they get. And the vision where it's almost like when you have blinders on and your life is too narrow, you're living too constrained. Where does Jesus give you a wider vision, the vision of the wideness of God's mercy, of God's grace, that is so much bigger than my own small life? You ever see some people like, they think like, "Oh, now I understand," or "Aha, this makes sense," or you see the light bulb going on, and you recognize, "Oh, I hadn't thought about that." Well, sometimes I recognize myself as just the opposite. I feel like so many adventures in missing the point. Just not having it all together. Just the pieces don't really make all sense. Sometimes I feel like I tried to gain access to a house through the window and tried to break it open. Well, the door is unlocked and wide open. So I tried to find my own way and am too narrow, running against the wall and not getting the message. Well, grace and sanctuary and healing and the wideness of God's mercy and of Jesus' love is so much bigger and wider than my own constraints. The question is just, am I willing to let go of my way and of the habits in which I've been doing? I've always done it that way. I've always limited myself here. Or am I willing to take that truth of Jesus to heart, deep down in my heart, that you and I were God's beloved? You don't have to earn that. You don't have to work yourself to death to receive God's grace. You just come as you are. Just come as you are. So the question is, what limiting scripts and stories and habits and voices in the back of your head do you live by? Because they're part of your story, part of how you grew up, messages you got from parents or from other people. And are you willing and able to challenge those voices with the grace of God, with the voice of Jesus, that you're my beloved, just as you are. What story, what stories, what scripts do you live by?